I want to introduce you to our Gansey Log Cabin Blanket. You may perhaps already have the pattern. If you don't, you'll find it on our website, Stolen Stitches. But once you have it, the next thing we're going to do is figure out yarns. What's the best yarn to use, how much of each you need, and how you can combine all of those different colors. Obviously, if you've got an extensive stash, then you can just pop in and pull colors that are going to match in the right weight. Or if you don't have a big stash at home, or you want to complement what you've got in your stash, then this will give you an idea for what you're looking at your local yarn shop. So let's take a look at the yarns and how to put it all together. Before you go too deep in picking out the yarn you're going to use for the pattern, it's a good idea to understand what we used in the blanket and then take a look at what you've got in your stash to see if you've got anything that is going to compare and work well with it. So there's a few different criteria you want to look at. The first one is the weight of yarn that you've got. So the yarn weight that we've used in this this particular blanket is Mota. We had another kit in Blosta, and both of those are listed as DK weight yarns. But if you take a look at the actual yarns, you'll see that the DK, it's a very heavy DK. And if you're in the US, what you're actually going to be looking at is a worsted or a light worsted weight. So keep that in mind when you're looking at it, is the actual yardage of it. And the weight or the thickness of it is a little bit deceptive, I think, because it's heavier than you think it's going to be. Part of the reason for that is because both of those are what would be known as woolen spun yarns. Woolen spun yarns, when it's spun, it traps a lot of air in there. So it's a kind of a thick, it's a wider yarn than the weight would suggest because there's so much air trapped in it. And when it's blocked, it blooms quite a bit and gives you kind of an open, fluffy feel to it. Both yarn options that we've picked are 100% wool. You can, of course, take a look at other different types of fibres, but it's going to have an impact on the finished piece. And we'll look at that further on as to what other options you might kind of consider as you're going through. And then of course the final bit is how much yarn do you have in your stash, and is there something that you can supplement so that you can perhaps use the largest amount of color in one and then kind of add in some other interesting contrast to match it up. So that's the first thing. Take a look at what you got, figure out if you've got something you can add to, and then go and pick yarns that you can supplement it with. So once you've taken a look at the yarns you've got, then you need to figure out colors and how they fit together. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about the blanket and how it's all laid out. There's three sizes. There is a small lap size. This one is the throw size, where if I can pull it across, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 in one direction. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, yes, and 3 in the other direction. The squares are going to be slightly different, the outer edge, depending on where they are. So the middle ones, they're about 16 inches square. When you come to the outer ones, it's a little bigger because it's slightly wider with the outside. So each of these squares is done separately. You start with this middle color, and what I've done is there's 5 colors altogether, and I've picked one contrast color, or one that kind of it complements but is a little different from the others you're doing. And then the other 4 colors I picked I used from lighter to darker, working my way around. There's a different, well, depending on which size you do, you're going to have a different amount of yarn. So go through the sizes. Each particular size will give the yardage for each color, but I'll also talk here about how each one is fit together, which will give you an idea if you swap the color orientation or where you're putting the colors, how that's going to impact it as well. So it begins with your central color here, and that's the color that you'll use at the very end. So that's the one that you're going to use the most of. So for the medium size, I'm just going to check. I think for this, I had 6 skeins I used for that for the main color. Then you move out here with the Garter Gansey circle first of all, and I use the lighter color where this first little one and then this second one. So you use the least amount of that color. Then the next one is coming over here where it's this square and this square, so that's the next color. Then you come over here for color number 3, and at this point now for the third color you're moving into the Gansey stitch pattern for these two. two different stitch patterns, and then the final one is here and here. So you can see this one is the biggest. So this one is going to be the second most yarn you'll use. The first most will be this one, because when you finished all the central one, your Gansey, you're going to be moving on to a final garter outer circle. And the amount of garter stitch that you work is going to depend on where it's at. Because we want the same width all the way around here and all the way around the edge. For the edge ones, you can see it's a wider strip of garter, but then when you do this inside strip, it's half the size, so that when you join it with the one next to it, this comes out the same width as this. So that's how you can kind of figure out, you can see why there's a difference then when you do your final edges, so that they'll all match up like this. And you're also using all the way around the outside your I-cord, so that you've got, when you put the I-cord on, that uses quite a bit of yarn. We've used the same color as the central one, but you could easily pick a different color to come through. So this one, you can see this is pretty bright, vibrant blues and a bright orange. So we've got some bright color contrasts. It's really poppy as you go through. But you could also opt to go ahead and do a much more subdued tone. The only thing I would suggest is whichever one you use for the middle and the edges, it works well either brighter or darker, or in some way contrasting with the other colors, so that it gives it a very cohesive feel between the middle and the outside. You also don't have to opt exactly for the way I've done the circling here, going from lighter to darker. But if you do end up changing it, I'd suggest even sketching it out, or just, I'm actually a big fan of using coloring pencils to just do little squares that you fit together, because I went through quite a few iterations before I reached this, with the first one kind of going between colors one square at a time, and it just didn't really pull it together. And this was the color combination that I ended up being happiest with, going from lights to dark with 2 in each, so it creates L-shaped blocks. You could, of course, put it all in one color, so it's going to be a very, very different looking blanket, but you absolutely could do that as well. So I think understanding how it fits together, how much of each color as you're going through is used, will mean that you can then go find the yarn weights that you have that work in your stash, figure out what colors you want for the main one and how much of each of those other colors you want. And remember, there's no hard and fast rule for this. Once you have enough colors and you have enough yarn in the colors you want, then play away with it and have fun. And you could even do a total patchwork quilt where you had every single one a different color. It's going to look very different, but I think it would look equally as beautiful. So for the blankets that we've done, we've opted for wool, and it's not a superwash wool, which we've gotten a woolen spun, so it's got obviously enough weight because it's a big blanket, but it's not too heavy because the air inside the woolen spun makes it a little bit lighter. However, woolen spun does take a little bit more care because it needs to be hand washed. You can't throw it to a machine. So if you're somewhere where there's going to perhaps be, you're gifting it to a house that you know that they won't be able to hand wash, or perhaps if you've got pets and you need to wash something frequently, then you might end up veering for something that's a little bit easier to wash on a regular basis. I wouldn't veer towards superwash, because I think if you went for a superwash wool, it's going to end up becoming very, very slippy, and the gauge will open up a bit. So if you don't want it to grow too much, then you want to keep away from superwash. Plus, superwash gets very, very heavy because it makes a denser fabric. However, doing something with, one of my favorites is cotton acrylic blends, because cotton can be washed, it's quite happen to be washed frequently, but it's heavy. So if you mix a little bit of acrylic in with it, like a 50-50, a heavy DK or Aran weight blend, it gives you a good mix of the two. So you've still got some natural fibre in there, a little bit of weight, a little bit of density, but it can still be washed on a regular basis. So do keep in mind where your blanket's going to end up. If it's with you and you know you can mind it, then make your choice based on what your preference is. But if you're gifting it, then kind of thinking through how it's going to be used afterwards and who's going to be minding it will make a really big difference. Once you've gone ahead and picked all of your colors and bought the yarn in and figured out what you're going to use, the next thing is to take a look at your gauge and your needle sizes. Obviously for this, the gauge is going to determine how big the finished blanket is. So if you're a very tight knitter but you're happy with the gauge you're getting, then you can just opt for a smaller needle size or a size that gets the size that you're happy with, just making sure that it's consistent. It will mean that if you are using if you get a looser gauge, you may find that you need to use more yarn. And there's something else to bear in mind as well with this. So I found the garter stitch and the Gansey, I got 2 different stitch gauges. And because of this, I've actually altered the pattern so that the garter stitch, which gives a slightly bigger gauge, I've used a smaller needle size, and the Gansey stitch is going to give you a wider row gauge. So garter stitch squishes down vertically, so you work more rows to get the same depth, but you don't work as many rows to get the same depth with the Gansey stitch. So you need to bear that in mind if you're getting a different row gauge or stitch gauge, that you may need to adjust how many rows you work in order to make sure that you're getting consistently square pieces when you finish. So keep that in mind, no matter what size you're doing, that you want to come out with ones where you can comfortably pick up your stitches and the rows match what's in the pattern, or if they're consistently different, you adjust how many rows you work as you go through. So once you've picked who the blanket's for, picked the type of fibres that you're going to use on it, and have enough of the yarn there to get started, the next thing you want to do before you begin is to swatch. And when you swatch, you want to swatch both garter stitch and the Gansey stitch, and make sure that you match both the stitch and the row gauge as you go through. So if you do your swatches, really like the fabric you're getting, it's not too tight and it's not too loose, but if it's a little bit off with one of them, then you need to make a few tweaks as you go along. So if your row gauge is a little different, then you may want to work either more rows or less rows to match the same width. Because of the fact that you're going to be working, as you go around, you'll consistently be picking up stitches across here. You want to make sure that the the width you've got here matches, so that when you pick up those stitches, it's going to lie flat for you. This did require quite a bit of toing and froing for me. So actually going through and consistently making sure each of those is the same width, whether it's garter stitch or whether it's Gansey stitches, means that it's going to lie flat and you're not going to get it either flaring or pulling in a great deal on the side. So it is a little different having something where the rows matter as much as the stitch gauge, but because you just keep working around, they both come into play when you're picking up stitches and when you're working each square as you go around. So with all of that information, you should be set to go shop your stash or at your local yarn shop to find the perfect yarn for your project. If you have found the perfect yarn, let us know below. And maybe even for a previous project, you found the ideal project for stash yarn that's been sitting there for a while. Perhaps you've got plenty in the weight, but not all in the same color, and you're opting for more of a quilted look, so each of the squares is different colors. I'd love to know. Let us know, pop in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like the video, and then you're never going to miss another video from us.